Hey everyone, we'll give people a few more minutes just to make sure if anybody strolling in last minute, then let them catch up with us. So we'll hang out for a few minutes here. But thanks for everybody who's already here. I'm excited to kind of get this group together. It's something that I've wanted to do for a long time, but just never really had the initiative to actually make it happen. So it's reassuring to see that people actually have an interest in it and that it could have the potential to grow in the future. For everybody who's already here right now, just I'm sure you got the notification on the way in. I am recording. I am recording, and I plan to upload this for future reference so that if anybody wants to come see the conversation for the future, if you want to refer back to this and use it as a study tool, then you can have that. My long-term kind of plan for this is to get everything kind of up and running through my website so that everything will be automated, and then it'll send out email notifications, and then you can either have calendar updates or anything like that. And then I'll have all of the video reviews, the summaries and everything published on YouTube. And then there will be links on my website that you can go back through and review those on a YouTube link. So that's kind of long-term vision. That's why I'm recording, is just so that I can publish this, and then you can all refer back to this in the future if you'd like to. So if you don't want your face in the video, feel free to turn off your camera. But you're welcome to talk and ask questions. Like I said, this is more of a study group. It's not meant to be like a lecture. I'm by no means a CPR expert or a cardiac expert. So feel free to chime in if you have questions, if you want to discuss anything further, or if you think something needs to be discussed further. All right, real quick before we get going too far, can everybody hear me? Can somebody acknowledge once they can hear me okay? Is the stream okay? All right, cool. All right, so for anybody who joined after I already gave my first spiel, first of all, the screen that you see right now, Spotlight Sports Solutions, is my company. I started it last year with the intention of helping out as many athletes as I possibly can. And my current role only allows me to help approximately 20 to 30, and they are specifically elite level soccer players. So that demographic is very small. I want to kind of expand my impact and help as many athletes as I can. So that's the purpose for creating the company. So anytime you see this logo or this name, that's my company. And then one of the branches that I'm trying to create in order to help as many athletes as I can is the study group. My hope is that we can kind of create some stimulating dialogue between athletic trainers and kind of make connections that everybody can meet new peers and share ideas with each other and kind of improve the current practices within the athletic training setting. I know a lot of this stuff, this kind of practice happens with physicians and physical therapists. To my knowledge, there aren't too many for athletic trainers. So I wanted to kind of start my own initiative there and see how many people we can expand this group to. So again, thank you all for being here and showing interest in the study group. And hopefully this can result in some positive impact in terms of educating us all so that we can improve our practices. That being said, the first week's topic is cardiac emergencies. and I'll kind of give an overview here just so you can kind of see what we'll go through. The way that my brain works, I tend to like to simplify things, and the three things that come to mind for me with cardiac is prevention, recognition, and management. So the first step of any kind of cardiac is nobody really wants to see it. So let's try to prevent as many of those as we can. Recognition. So if it does happen, if things do slip through the crack or if something unexpected happens, we're prepared for it. We can see it and we can deal with it. So providing proper management, making sure that we're getting the athlete the care that they need in order to survive quite a significant emergency. Some of the important links that I've used to kind of build this presentation, a lot of policies and statements from various stakeholders and organizations. It's kind of interesting to note there's some discrepancies among them, and specifically across like the American Heart Association and the American Medical Society and the professional sports organizations. The American Heart Association doesn't suggest the use of an EKG or ECG for baseline exam. Interesting. So in the again, I touched into this. The is the step. Pretty much the organization that an athletic trainer works in takes a pre-participation physical exam of some sort, and include various which you're in. So I know it's a network. So a lot of us have similar PPEs, but for anybody who's at a different setting, you probably know that you might not have the same resources or the same policies that are regulated by the league. So first, the history is probably the most common, and that's amongst any age group, any demographic, starting with symptoms, family history. Moving into the physical exam, pretty much any doctor during a physical is going to assess the sounds of the heart, and assess the sounds of the valves and make sure that the heart sounds like it's working okay. These are a good start, but they ultimately miss a lot of things. It's a pretty low sensitivity in terms of predicting cardiac events. So that's kind of why the initiative of the professional organizations is to take it a step further and get an EKG and the echo. Kind of an important distinction that was made in the paper, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is the use of a 5-lead EKG or a 12-lead EKG. There's a small difference there, but for sports cardiology, it is an important difference. And then lastly, with the EKGs, the sports cardiology expertise is important. A lot of times the EKG might show something that in a general population could be concerning, and that might flag a false positive that might rule out an athlete depending on the league's policy, or might delay them getting involved with practice or games, and that would be really disruptive for especially for professional athletes. So having a sports cardiology trained EKG analyst would be critical. And then a lot of doctors now are kind of getting up to date or up to speed with the shared decision-making process. They're no longer the ones saying, hey, you have this condition, or hey, your EKG shows this, we want you to sit out. Now it's a lot of times it's risk management and educating the athlete on what the risks are, what the concerns are, and letting them make that decision. So it's more collaborative now, and that will be definitely a trend in the future, is that shared decision-making is going to be huge. Lastly, for prevention, on-site AEDs is critical. I think most is by now as this as an trainer well. A lot of public universities for that, but the all right, let's try this again. Can you hear me? All right, cool. So I'm actually at the library now, and the Wi-Fi here is really bad. So I switched it to my phone's hotspot. So for whatever reason, my phone's hotspot is better Wi-Fi than the library's Wi-Fi. Okay, I don't know. Is there a point where you guys want me to go back to? Is there something that it started to break up?
I think it was starting from like the beginning, honestly.
Yikes.
So you should probably just start again. Yeah,
Yikes.
yikes is right, but
All right, back to the beginning it is. Thanks for shouting it out. Sorry for the inconvenience, everybody. All right, so all the way back to the overview. This is kind of the overview. My brain works by compartmentalizing things. I broke it down into what I see as the three kind of main objectives of cardiac emergency: prevention, recognition, management. And within those, we'll break down each of those a little bit later in the presentation. In the literature review, I've posted a bunch of links. So when I publish these slides, you can all visit these different policies and position statements if you would like to. And then here we'll get into the detail a little bit more. So from prevention, give me 1 second. For prevention, the first step and the most common step for pretty much everybody is the pre-participation physical exam. But there is some nuance within different leagues, different organizations, and what they require. So most places are going to require, at the bare minimum, a history and a physical exam by a doctor. But those are pretty low sensitivity, and those miss a lot of the cardiovascular diseases that predispose somebody to a cardiovascular event like a sudden cardiac arrest. So that's why a lot of organizations require that you have additional screenings like the EKG and the echo. And specifically with the EKG, sports cardiology expertise is important because without that, a false positive might rule out an athlete who is otherwise healthy just because on presentation it might look like a condition. So sports cardiology expertise is critical there. Shared decision making is an kind of a evolving process, but it's becoming increasingly more important. And then having an on-site AED is probably the easiest step you can take to prevent cardiac death. Recognition. So this one is pretty interesting for athletic trainers. So this is where I left off. Hopefully everybody's caught back up to speed. Recognition is it's easier said than done with athletic trainers. With replay, with slow motion, everything is easy to see. You can zoom in and see the guy's face. You can see whether there was a collision or not. You can go back in time and review everything. So it's very easy on TV. But in live time, for athletic trainers. This is probably the hardest part of cardiac management. The key here for me is if you see a stumble or an unexplained collapse, assume it's a sudden cardiac arrest until you have other rationale that would explain it. So if somebody has non-contact, they just collapse to the ground, assume it's a sudden cardiac arrest and start the emergency process, rather than going out and doing your primary survey. Okay, what's going on? Is the scene safe? That kind of stuff. So you can be a bit more expedited if you see a sudden unexplained collapse. The NATA's position statement specifically touches on the myoclonic jerk and the seizure-like activity. This is kind of important as well because a lot of times athletic trainers will see these people and they will think they're having a seizure and they will try to stabilize them rather than start compressions. So don't confuse the seizure-like activity with a seizure or some kind of an MTBI. If you see somebody suddenly unexplained collapse and you see these seizure-like activities, again, start the compressions, activate the emergency action plan. Agonal gasping, painful gasping, labored breathing, all of those kinds of things, they can continue to breathe after having a sudden cardiac arrest. It doesn't necessarily mean they're conscious. Their eyes might be open. They might look like they are just kind of out of it. But again, this is possible even while having a sudden cardiac arrest. So don't confuse these signs with some other condition and spend too much time evaluating the athlete. Go into your compressions, activate the EAP. Recognition. So this is a lot of different videos to kind of help people see what does it look like. And again, it's easy with these camera angles and slow motion, and they have 480 and they're just like, they're 4K and zoom in everything. So it's very easy to see in these videos, but it will help you kind of recognize, okay, well, from a different perspective, what might this look like? And specifically the How to Save a Life video is really good. They talk about the different kind of warning signs. They show clips from different sports. So depending on your sporting assignment, it's going to present a little bit differently. The Christian Eriksen, for anybody who's in the soccer field, that video is really good to watch and review. The physios there spent a decent amount of time evaluating. It was on the far side of the pitch, and that's always tough to see for athletic trainers. So far side of the pitch, they had to run out there, and then by the time they get to them, they've already spent a minute since the collapse. So when you think about your time to administering the AED, then this can be kind of problematic because your recognition has to be very quick. That brings us to management. So actually dealing with the emergency, the first step is always activate the EMS. And I think that's something that we all get trained on every year, but it's something that still gets missed by athletic trainers every year, which is why they keep harping on it in all of the training and recertification, that kind of stuff. So never forget to activate the EMS before you start CPR, before you start any kind of emergency care. Aiming to have less than 3 to 5 minutes for drop to shock. And so that's from the collapse, getting the pads placed and administering the shock. It should be aimed to have less than 3 to 5 minutes in that emergency situation. Something that I'm curious about is if anybody practices with a timer. I know a lot of us go through our EAPs and practice, but timing the events and actually seeing how long would it take you to get across the field? How long would it take somebody to then go get the AED? How long would it take to get the pads out, get the shirt off, that kind of stuff? How long does it truly take you to administer that shock? And I think a lot of times this gets kind of skimmed over in the EAP practice. We all circle around the quote unquote collapsed victim and we say, okay, they're here and they just collapsed. What do you do? And then from there, it's really easy. Okay, well, go get the AED. And it's always conveniently like 5 feet away from you. You just have to turn around and grab it. Practice in the actual environment in which you're going to have to administer it. So that includes both practice and game facilities. That includes in the airport, on the bus, things like that. Like think about all of the places you might have to apply an AED to save somebody's life and practice the timing of all of those different things. One of the coolest experiences I've had as a clinician is I worked at Camp Woodward, Action Sports Camp out in Pennsylvania. And one of the EAP practices that they did is they actually brought in a helicopter. They took somebody on life evac, and we practiced the timing of that. So from the time that somebody quote unquote fell off of the mini mega ramp, so kind of theoretical 30-foot fall, now they've got some kind of a C-spine injury and they're non-responsive. So pretty cool experience, but it was really good practice for all of us to see, okay, it's going to take them 20 minutes. We could be stabilizing for 20 minutes here. And I think the same applies for cardiac emergencies. Practice and time your practices. Provide the high quality CPR until the AED arrives. This is pretty standard here, 2-inch depth, 100 to 120 beats per minute. I heard a funny joke at the MLS medical meetings. The BPM you can remember depending on if you're an optimist or a pessimist. It's either staying alive or another one bites the dust. That made me chuckle. And then the last piece there for management is transport. So making sure that you have EMS looped in on your locations, making sure that they are either on scene or prepared to get to your scene very quickly. The sooner you can get them transported to the hospital, the better their outcomes are going to be. That brings us to the actual publication. So this is the paper that I chose to review for this week. The more specific kind of deep dive, what I would like to do for the cardiac paper, as opposed to the general overview that was just provided. So just curious, either show of hands in the Google meeting or voice or any kind of response would be helpful here. Did anybody actually get the free trial to read the full paper? No takers? All right, that's fine. I didn't assume that anybody would. I went through the deep dive in the reading, so I can fill in any gaps. But for the most part, the free version covered pretty much everything, all the big points, the big talking points, and the kind of critical nature of the contemporary review. They went through kind of common practices and what can be done to be improved. So the first step was the epidemiology, and within the epidemiology, I thought that there was some kind of interesting points. The first one I wrote down was that the males have a 2 to 10x risk of sudden cardiac arrest. And I kind of thought to myself, well, why would that be? Like, why is the risk? Surely there's some genetic component there. And obviously that's going to have influence on the likelihood of an SCA. But why specifically is that? And what the paper broke down was hormones, disease expression, and physical adaptation. So as you're training for some kind of cardio event, especially endurance events, and you start to get these thickening of the heart, the male anatomy just tends to hypertrophy more, and that can lead to like ventricular hypertrophy, which leads to obstructions, which leads to sudden cardiac arrest. So really interesting kind of bullet point there, but it's applicable and something to consider with your population is who do you work with? Do you work with men or do you work with women? Are they more likely or less likely to have sudden cardiac arrest? Then to go even more in depth, okay, so you know that males are more susceptible to it. Which sports are most susceptible? And the ones listed here were basketball, football, cycling, and soccer/football. And within those sports, so what's kind of confusing to me is that it's not consistent. I mean, you think, okay, well, basketball, high heart rate, a lot of constant action. They don't get a lot of rest in between plays. But then you get something like American football, and it's like, well, they probably run like 12 seconds at most, and then they get to rest for 3 minutes. So commercial breaks and all kinds of stuff change the nature of that American football game, but it's different than the other three. So I'm kind of curious if anybody has an explanation for why that might be, if it's just the intensity, if it's the equipment, if it's the stress of the sport, if there's, what do you guys think? Is there anything that stands out to you as to why American football would be in this group with the endurance sports? No takers again. the talkative
So
study group.
maybe just like contact.
Sorry?
Just like high contact. Like,
Yeah.
what happened in DeMar Hamlin?
Right. Could be. Yeah. More cases of commodio cordis, maybe.
Yeah.
Anybody else? All right, I'll take that as a no. So then the next point is that Black athletes have up to 5x risk of sudden cardiac arrest and sudden cardiac death. And this one, again, jumped out to me. It's like, well, what's the reason for that? Is there some kind of congenital reason here? Is there some kind of socioeconomic reason? What's going on here? And there was a quote that stood out to me that I wrote down from the paper. And it says, race has been historically, but erroneously, assumed to be a fixed biological determinant of disease and health outcomes. This preconception has resulted in reinforcement of racial biases across the medical system. So think about the athletes that we are working with. If you work with Black athletes, what kind of prejudices might you have, or what kind of unconscious biases might you have? Can you address them in your pre-participation physical screenings? To better identify the at-risk groups, those kinds of things. So can we improve the survivability of these Black athletes? It says non-white athletes had half the survival rate of white athletes. And this was direct from the epidemiology report in the paper. So it's kind of fascinating stuff, but it's also really like sad stuff. Like this shouldn't be the case. And I think it should be something that can be improved. So the other thing the paper did was it broke down young athletes, which they defined as under 35, which is not that young. But for the case of the paper, they're comparing them to over 35, which is typically in the 50s, which would be the master athletes. So those are senior athletes that are competing at a high level. And within that population, there's what's called the exercise paradox. And that is typically the more active you are, the healthier you are, and the less likely that you are to have a sudden cardiac arrest. But if you are in the senior population and you have a stable coronary artery disease, but then you activate and your heart rate gets elevated and you're pushing yourself beyond your capacity, then you start to kind of trigger some of these ischemic incidents, and that can lead to an increase in sudden cardiac arrest in the senior population, even amongst the active population. So really interesting stuff there. The next thing that they brought up was the causes of these sudden cardiac arrests. And again, they differentiated between young and master. And within those different populations, there's obviously a large difference in the causes. For the master age group, there's pretty much only one cause, and it's coronary artery disease. They talked about the acute plaque rupture a little bit and ischemic pathologies a little bit, but by and large, it's coronary artery disease, and that's pretty much it. I believe the percentage, I have it written down here, 63 to 91% of master SCA is caused by coronary artery disease. So not even close. The other thing that was really interesting with the master population is that 98% of them were with male athletes. So again, there's some interesting kind of social rationales for what's going on there. Why are there so many male sudden cardiac arrests and so little female? It could just be competitive nature. It could be interests. It could be a whole lot of things. But that was something that kind of stood out to me. With the young population, there's a whole host of different conditions that could cause the SCA. And this is kind of why the pre-participation physical exam is so important. So you have your structural causes, your hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, your coronary artery disease, your mitral valve prolapse, those kind of things. And those are not going to be picked up by a history unless they have a family history of it. And they're not going to be picked up by the physical exam. So that's why the EKG becomes so important, or the echo. And a lot of professional organizations require the echo with Doppler. So you can see a lot of those structural changes. The congenital issues are somewhat well known, but they're not very known amongst athletic trainers. So it might be important to discuss those if you have a case like that with your cardiologist, your team's cardiologist. Wolf Parkinson White and long QT are probably the two most obvious, but then in the NBA's policy guide, they actually talk about Marfan syndrome. Probably not too many soccer players or gymnasts that have Marfan syndrome just because their height, their length, that kind of stuff. But with NBA, if you work with basketball players, that might be something to consider, is that Marfan presentation. Acquired, we talked a little bit about with the myocarditis and the HCM. But then the other one that we kind of touched on just in the possible causes for football players is the commotio cordis. So the contact to the center of the chest. And it's really rare because it has to happen at a very specific point in the electrical signal to disrupt it. So very unlikely that it happens, but I've seen it happen on a baseball player. It was a pitcher and the ball was hit right back up the middle and hit him in the chest, and that caused it. And obviously the big case that everybody's familiar with here is Damar Hamlin. And that case is all over YouTube. So if you want to review that case, feel free to. The most common cause of youth or young in this paper, sudden cardiac arrest, was it's called ANSUD, autopsy negative sudden unexplained death, meaning that they did the autopsy and they looked at the heart and they couldn't explain why their heart stopped. There's no structural defect. They didn't have a congenital defect. There's no trauma. There's nothing that can explain why it happened. It's yet to be known. It's a mystery. So one of the things that they are working to do within cardiology literature is to have better correlation between pre-participation in physical exams and the cardiology reports, so that researchers can go back in hindsight and say, well, this individual passed away. What did his echo actually look like? And being able to link the autopsy with the PPEs. So interesting future implications there for studies and research purposes. And then the other one that was big within this paper was talking about the autopsy of minorities specifically, and they were talking about pairing resources for Black individuals with the structural defects, the congenital defects, that kind of stuff, and making sure that the documentation, the literature is consistent across the database, so that when we do these epidemiology reports, that data exists in a better, more coherent piece. So the last piece here that I wanted to kind of discuss with you all, and I wanted to get some involvement here, would be the environmental piece. And they talked a little bit about climate change as a risk factor, but then also urban air pollution. So I live in Houston. I know a few of you live in Houston as well. We all know the air quality is awful here. But to my knowledge, we've never had to cancel a training session. We've never had to cancel a game because of air quality. I know they did it in LA. Has anybody had experience with canceling training or game events because of air quality and urban air pollution? No, it's pretty rare.
I had one last season when I was working in college, and there were wildfires in Huntsville. And we ended up having to cancel the game against Sam Houston.
So that's really interesting to me, because it's not something that most emergency action plans are going to have a plan in place for. I mean, we have like heat exposure, we have cold exposure, we have lightning safety, we have all of these policies put in place for various climate issues, but that's one that's not very commonly talked about. And to my understanding, there's not a great like literature of the air quality and when it's safe to play or when it's not. The best example I can give is there was the explosion that happened in Houston last year, and the air quality was awful, and it was all over the news, but it wasn't enough to cancel whatever events were going on. So I think it'd be interesting to see if this becomes a more frequent event, especially with the climate change and the wildfires increasing. Do schools or organizations start to put in place a policy for these different climate disasters? Before I go forward, anybody have any questions that they wanted to kind of dive into deeper? Anything unclear?
I have a question.
Go on.
I like the statistic of Black athletes being more susceptible to cardiac events. Did they do any research in terms of that being linked to any sickle cell trait?
They did. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I can send it to you. They looked into it and it wasn't related to sickle cell. They basically said there wasn't a biological cause for it, and that it was more likely to be sociological or economical. My suspicion is that a lot of it is economical, and they're probably playing sports at impoverished schools that probably don't have an AED or an athletic trainer present. So I know a lot of public schools are starting to mandate athletic trainers are present for sporting events, but that's still catching up. That's a state-by-state mandate. So my suspicion is that it's probably more economical than it is biological, but I can send you the statistics on that and what they said specifically about sickle cell.
Yeah, that'd be great. And then I think another thing that I was gonna say is like based off the AQI, the pollution stuff. Like I know the NWSL has created a policy, especially for game days, where depending on what the AQI is, either it's canceled or there has to be oxygen required behind the benches, stuff like that, and the league monitors that. So the league will call the team and say basically, hey, you have to do this and this is what you have to provide, or we're going to cancel the game. So like I think it was last year in LA, I think a game got canceled. At Portland, a game got canceled. So I know like some of the bigger leagues are starting to look into that, but I agree that maybe like in terms of public schools and colleges, I don't think they really take that into effect as much.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. I was not aware of that. So cool to hear that at least some of the bigger leagues. And again, when you have like the NBA is probably the most up to date with those kind of things, but they play indoors, so they're never going to have a policy about that. But with these outdoor sports, football, soccer, baseball, it's cool to see the trend that they're at least starting to pay attention to those things, but I'm curious to see how long it's going to take for them to catch up to it. Especially I wonder about like the quality of like early implementation. So the AQI, I'm assuming, stands for air quality index. How is the accuracy of that in relation to whether it's some kind of a lung pathology or a cardiopathology? Just curious to see, like, is that actually correlated with anything, or is it just an early stage kind of preventative effort? Any other questions before we go on?
Yeah, while we're on the topic of it, I'm not too familiar with the issues that can arise with air quality. So what do you think can happen acutely and maybe long term if you were to play in these conditions for a long period of time?
Well, specifically on this topic, obviously the paper is diving into cardio pathologies. I would assume that there would probably be some maladaptation. I would assume that there would be some kind of asthma pathologies, lung respiratory conditions that are going to develop. But with the cardio specifically, if your respiratory distress, if you're in respiratory distress, your risk of cardio incident is going to go up. So for the acute, I would say that the cardio risk is going to go up. Whether that's, I don't know how to quantify that. Again, I don't know if that epidemiology exists. I would doubt it. And I would doubt that anytime soon research would be like that, because I don't know how you would measure risk factor with cardio events during a risky environment. Like they're never going to put people in that situation to compare and contrast that. So I don't know the exact risk rates, but I would assume that your cardio risk rates will go up, and then also probably long-term chronic exposure would probably be more like asthma or respiratory conditions. Anybody have any experience with that or insight into that?
I don't have anything like statistically, but even when we were in Huntsville, we had a handful of girls that were asthmatic that like couldn't even really go outside. And we were probably 10 miles ish from the wildfires, and we had to bring their food to them. They couldn't go outside.
Yeah. Yeah. So triggers for existing conditions would definitely be a thing. Another one would be like allergies. I know a lot of people that have poor respiratory function during like allergy season. If there's poor air quality, they have a lot of respiratory distress. It's just harder for them to breathe, which in daily life might not be that big of an issue, but for athletics specifically is going to be tough to participate if you're not getting sufficient oxygen. So yeah, again, it's hard to quantify that in terms of any real risk, but those would be kind of the general risks that you're going to deal with and manage. Anybody else? All right, cool. Let's finish this thing out. The management within the paper, it's pretty plain Jane. They talk about having an EAP, being able to recognize sudden cardiac arrest, providing high quality CPR, applying the AED as soon as possible, and then regular reviews of the EAP is probably the only thing that they really pointed out that was of significance that was different than what anybody is taught for any kind of basic CPR. One of the quotes that I really like from the military is that you don't rise to the level of the occasion, you fall to the level of your training. And I think that's really relevant in emergency context. So if you think that you're prepared, time yourself and see. If you, we have in our facility, we have 7, I believe 8 soccer fields. And so, for example, if I'm on one field and across the diagonal, I'm also responsible for coverage of the whole facility. The fastest way is for me to get on the golf cart and drive all the way across the facility. That alone took me 1:30. So from there, I've got to recognize the situation. I've got to apply the pads. I've got to get the shirt off, all of those things in 1:30 in order to apply that 3 to 5 minute drop to shock time. So again, like I encourage all of you to time yourself in these emergency situations and see, are you as prepared as you think you are? And then also I would probably add about 10% of whatever it took you in a calm situation, because under rehearsal, everything is smooth, you're relaxed. But in an emergency, in a true emergency, you are going to be flustered, you're going to be panicked, your hands aren't going to work like you want them to. And so you're really going to fall to the level of your training. And if that's not up to par, then you're probably not going to provide good outcomes. One more thing, sorry, on the EAP, one suggestion that they did make that I think is a really good piece of advice is to include local EMS on emergency preparedness and EAPs. So let them know your plan for where to be picked up. Let them know your plan for who is going to take control when they get there, who is going with them to the hospital, which hospital are they going to. If it's a cardio event, obviously you have to have increased standards for the hospital. If it's trauma, different kind of things like that to consider. So work with your EMS and make sure that they know who you are. If there's a common expression amongst athletic trainers that your first time meeting your local EMS should not be during an emergency. So highly encourage that practice as well. Loop them in on your practices, get their advice on how to make things smoother so that we can better transport these athletes and help try to keep them alive. So in summary, I broke it down into kind of 3 different categories: prevention, recognition, and management. And we talked about kind of the different position statements and guidelines from various organizations. I have the links if anybody wants to read more about those. And then we went into the actual paper. Findings and discussion points for contemporary views and kind of evolving practices. And study. So again, thank you all.